Now let's talk with Sally Bingham. Sally, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to have you here to talk about this very important issue. You've been at this a long time.
I have.
And I'm just curious, what was the epiphany, what was the initial inspiration that really opened your eyes to do this work?
Daniel, I'd have to do another 20 minutes.
I know.
It's a long story. It's because I was a trustee for a big national environmental organization called Environmental Defense Fund, and I was hearing from scientists and economists what humans were doing to the planet, but I never heard from the pulpit anything about saving creation. No religious leader. I've been an Episcopalian all my life. I've been attending church since I was a child, before I was a child even, and never heard anybody talk about protecting creation, even though we pray for a reverence for the earth. We ask God to help us have the courage not to use resources rightly without harming anyone else, and yet no one was talking about this. So 20 years ago, I started asking clergy, why do we never hear about this?
Were you already a clergy person at that time?
I was not. I was not. There was this very definite vacuum, and the religious community had abdicated its responsibility, at least as far as I thought.
So did you go to seminary, aware that you wanted to be a priest who was going to be an activist in the environmental movement, or did that unfold as a surprise?
Well, I didn't go to seminary thinking I would be a priest at all. I went to seminary looking for where was the disconnect between what we say we believe in and how we behave. And during that process, during my middler year when everyone goes off and has to do a field education, I didn't even go to a church and become a seminarian because I never thought I would be behind an altar or in a pulpit. And so I started the Commission for the Environment for the Diocese of California with the permission and blessing of our bishop. And it was those people sitting around my dining room table every Tuesday afternoon saying, you ought to be ordained. And I resisted and resisted. And it's one of those situations where, I felt like Mary, was I going to say yes to God or not? And eventually I was persuaded that if no one else was going to be in the pulpit talking about saving creation, then maybe this was my calling and that it was real and I needed to do it. However, nobody has been ordained to do an environmental ministry in the Episcopal Church prior to my doing this. Therefore, it was a 10-year process. I was a seminarian in a church. After we went through all this, maybe it was a real call to ordination, but I worked in a congregation where they said, don't ever mention the word ecology. And I did baptisms and assisted at weddings and funerals, and I did all the things that the priest didn't want to do and had me doing. For 3 full years, and then the process of school and all of those things. Eventually, having gone to college, seminary, 3 years in a parish to prove that this was real. 10 years later, 1997, I was ordained as an Episcopal priest. And of course now, all I do is talk about religion and the environment, and I go all over the country to different churches and different denominations.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. You said, I think we misquoted earlier in the program, there are actually 10,000 congregations involved in this movement right now.
There are.
It's incredibly interesting to me. I love the book, The Multi-Faith Perspective, Love God, Heal Earth. It's clearly a multi-faith issue that people are dealing with. What is your sense of how we're doing on this? Because it feels, and Lillian and I talked a little bit about this beforehand, it feels like, well, of course we should be doing something, but are we doing enough? Is the movement finding the right language, and is it making the progress it needs to make with the urgency it needs to make it?
I don't think I could ever say we're doing enough.
Okay.
We can always do more, but we have made tremendous progress just in the last 10 years, and you can tell from the book. I mean, we have Buddhists and Muslims and Catholics and evangelicals, Jewish people, Baha'is. Most mainstream religions have some kind of a mandate on climate change, not just on environmental stewardship, but on climate change now. And the movement is beginning, and I believe now that the religious voice involved in this dialogue is going to make the change happen that needs to happen. Environmental organizations have been working on this for 30 years. We had, if you think back to when we tried to ask people to stop smoking, and doctors and scientists said smoking will hurt you, it was 20 years before people actually stopped smoking. However, it happened almost overnight as soon as enough people understood it. And I think that's what we're approaching, is a multitude of people who are beginning to understand the climate problem is real, and it's urgent, and it's serious. And once that moral voice steps in and says, it's immoral to be destroying the livelihood and stability of poor people, not only in the United States, but all around the world.
I have a question for you about what gives you perhaps the heart for this or the passion for it. And many of us experience the divine when we're in creation. But what for you is that place where you feel most connected to the divine? What is that natural place?
Well, it is, just as you say. I grew up in the country. I have a very, very strong sense of the divine in nature. And I think you'll find when you're talking to folks that most people who go out into nature have a strong sense of God there. And if you ask some of the folks that we work with, why are you doing this work? It's because of their natural, when they're in nature, their connection to God and that feeling that God is really present. And I believe that the world is a manifestation
Absolutely.
of God.
Thank you for reminding us of that.